people are not necessarily born, but it's just to know that, of course, normally, and that's how societies would be. Um, then, of course, this societies are organized in a certain way. Okay, so they operate together. People stay together, live together, share together, they do things together for the benefit of everybody. They are a community. So, of course, if you have to be in a community, you have to live in a certain way. So, there is societies of social organization. Okay, relations that exist among parties, um, so that you'll have like kind of a structure, maybe for a society, not necessarily very formal kind of structure. If you think about an organization, it has a structure. The CEO is a board, it's a CEO. There is maybe maybe the CTO, maybe the CFO, maybe the COO, then, and people are no. Perhaps in organization, societies, the structure is not as formal, but they're kind of like different ways of running societies. For instance, one of them is around control and sanctions. You see, if you're in an organization, last time you were talking about policies, we shall probably revisit that on Wednesday. But policies are guidelines that that more or less govern operations. So there's certain guidelines. There are certain guidelines. There are certain practices. Okay, we share a few, for instance, for UN. So there's that. For instance, there's a data protection policy. So this is what we must do as an organization to make sure that there's things like privacy. There's things like ensuring access to the right data, maybe ensuring that we don't become vulnerable. So there are certain practices and guidelines that are put in place for an organization. So, and then, of course, your organization are told, this is what we do. And perhaps in certain instances, you're told, you must do this. Failure to do this is going to happen. Okay, so for us, even in countries, there's ways in which these are laws. If we don't follow these laws, we'll do this. But perhaps in societies, it's a bit more than that, because there's so many different things we do and actions which are not guided by law. So, so there's social control, and this is how people behave. This is how group behavior is directed. So this is how we do things here. You're not in the society. You're not taken to class, and you're told, "Hey, you do this, 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 this." Perhaps you leave. If you join an organization, like some of you probably are in some of these organizations. Maybe they sat you down, and then took you through the structure, the system, different sections, different section heads, and everything, and the different people. Then you're introduced. But perhaps if you're employed, they'll take you through orientation, and orientation means taken through perhaps by HR. Then you're told to introduce to different sections, and you're perhaps taken around. Then maybe for some organization you're told you have to work here for a month, or maybe for 3 weeks or a month. That did so different areas, so that you have global way of seeing things. Then of course you go to your area. Of course, I'm more formal. The others perhaps you just take you to your station, but still you need to understand how the whole thing works. But perhaps an organization which has rules, very strict rules on how things are done. But perhaps in society it's more of behavior, right? How do we do things? You just learn and you begin to fit into it. For instance, think about a situation. Some of us probably grew up in the rural areas, and in some of those areas, people were keeping livestock, right? And others perhaps were farming crops. There's a way in which livestock their main food are greens, vegetation, right? But if you have 10 head of cattle and you go and find a very lush green young maize plantation, 10 acres, you don't drive your cows in there and then they say, they're very hungry, they're going to feed, no. But yeah, there are rules, but in a society like that, you get to learn as opposed to being told you don't do this. For instance, say, think about how when some of us were little, we grew up in the rural areas, and before there was piped water. I think for me, water, I grew up, I think for us where I live, piped water came in when I was probably in high school. But growing up as a little boy, we used to get water from the stream, right? So if you're going to get water from a stream for drinking, there's a way in which we have to learn how to take care of that stream. You can't go upstream and begin washing your clothes in the river. That means you're destroying everybody downstream. They're going to be taking soap and dirty water and stuff like that. So how do you ensure that this is what we're calling social control, okay? So one of the things they would use is education. Now, in societies, more often than not, we're not talking about people going to kindergarten and then going to primary school. No. There's a way of conditioning. It's more of conditioning. It's more of you grow up, and perhaps in your house, in your home, in your family, you learn things. You're educated, but you are not taken to school by your mom or your dad. Hey, you do this. But by and large, that's what we're talking about. There's actually education, and you get to learn as you go along. So it could be formal, may not necessarily be formal. Okay. For instance, one of the things that is used is get to learn, right? That's one. That's what you're talking about education. The other one is sanction. So that in that family, there are things you don't do, yeah? You just learn the ticking as a little girl, as a little boy, that sugar is very sweet and it's different, it's nice. To get to learn, this one is you put in tea or coffee or uji, You don't go there and say it's very nice and you just begin to take it. If you do that, you're told, hey, you don't do this. And next time mom comes home and finds you have sugar all over your mouth and lips, she begin asking, hey, you, what, you're all there's all kind of powder on your lips and cheeks. What's going on? Oh, nothing. And tell me what you've been doing. Nothing. And then she goes to the sugar jar and finds out it's half. Then that day you get to learn, when we said we don't do this, we don't eat sugar, we don't. That's a sanction. Maybe they take you, in the bedroom and, your backside gets hot a little bit. Tomorrow you think twice. So there are sanctions, rewards or punishment. Perhaps it could be a reward for something you've done that's really celebrated. And so okay, as a little boy, all right. People are very happy with me and they really were happy, they gave me gifts, so I'm going to do that tomorrow. So that's sanctions. So on one hand you learn, on the other hand there's a way in which as human beings we learn discipline, sometimes by the things we suffer or the things we love. Okay, so that's sanctions. Okay, so we're talking about social organization. Okay, one is learning, that's education, the other one is sanction. So if, for instance, you know that if you have 10 head of cattle and that 10 head of cattle, you don't take care of it, and they just happen to walk on the road and someone's fence has an issue and the cows go in there and thoroughly feed, and then they are found, you will have to talk to the chief and the elders. By the time they're done with you, you may have to sell one of the cows, So if that happens twice, you don't do that again. That's a kind of a sanction. Okay, then of course, another way of the organization is, of course, authority. Authority, there's a difference between authority and power. For instance, the ability to channel behavior of others without threats or use of sanctions. Ideally, someone who really has authority, they don't have to use threats, okay, or sanctions. if I don't want to get political here, but I guess one can say, if you find the police on patrol, normally they would have guns, semi-automatic weapons. So I guess that one, there is a threat of action. So you gotta toe the line. But perhaps you find a traffic cop, and you're driving down the road, coming in at 100 kilometers an hour, but he just raises his hand or her hand, you gotta slow down, because he has the authority, or she has the authority of the state. It's a police officer in charge of the road, okay? That's authority. Of course, you could decide not to, but then it takes on something else. But more often than not, they have authority. And I guess, for instance, if you think about it, the president has authority. President passes executive actions. He doesn't have to come knocking your heads, but ideally, in a properly functioning country or society or nation state, the president has authority. Okay, he can, for instance, work with parliament and say, we want to do this, and they come up with legislation for that. He doesn't have to threaten them. Or, he can decide there's going to be an executive action. Okay, so that's authority. Then, of course, there's power. Okay, that is the ability to channel behavior by the use of threats or use of function. So, of course, think about it. So we call the police officers law enforcement officers, right? So, the criminal justice system has power. Go before majesty, they can throw you in jail. Okay, so that is now the other side. Now that is power. Now power, for instance, to arrest someone and take them to court. Power to this and that. So more or less they got together. So basically saying, in most societies there will be people with authority, whether it's a traditional side where there was a chief, or whether there was the power, of course, to enforce. So, of course, there's a way in which, if someone has authority, ultimately from far, people know that that authority can be exercised. For instance, the CEO of an organization has authority. Yeah, they don't have to threaten you, but we all know that, because they're the face of the organization, because they've been placed there to head of the organization, because they're in charge of strategy, then whatever they come up with, of course, if they're advisors, then you follow. Because if you don't, and you decide you're not going to, then of course they may have to take you to HR, and HR perhaps would decide, did you understand these policies? Well, they explain to you, yes. So you have to show cause why discipline should not be taken against you, because of, you went against these policies and guidelines that are clear. Then of course you begin to realize, okay, now there's power play here, because it basically means I could get discipline, including perhaps suspension or being sacked or something. So then there's a way in which they got together. Sorry. So the last one is norms or custom. So societies normally would have norms of behavior, or things you do, things you don't do. Okay, so that they are accepted, and probably this is part of what the learning is all about. You get to learn the norms, you get to learn what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and by and large, I guess you learn you have to follow them. So that has to do with customs. So those are the norms, and many times, like even in our country, a lot of things we do are out of norms. Okay. Many times you find when law is enforced is because we are basically saying these are the norms, but some people are deviant. Okay, so for deterrence, we put boundaries. You say everybody knows this is what we should do, but you must not pass through here. When you get here, you're at the fringe, you're at the frontier now of becoming deviant. If you do that, this is what's going to happen to you. So now that laws come into place. So of course there are commands and they say you cannot do this. If you do this, this is what's going to happen to you. So these are all different ways of organizing a society so that it actually is able to flow together as a unit, as a community working together. So allow me to just talk about an idea here in probably 2-3 slides. So I don't know whether you know this, but the Greeks still rule the world, right? Yeah, when they talk about the Greeks, they talk about the philosophers. They go back, way back, like 500 BC, like Plato and Socrates. And you say, what did you say? They rule the world? Well, have you heard of things like democracy? Well, we got them from the Greeks. Let me give you another one. Have you heard of something called science? The scientific method. At the very, very basis of science is philosophy. You may not have known that, but science is based on philosophical assumptions at the very base. So the scientific method has certain things. For instance, what is knowledge? How can you know? What is knowledge? How do we define knowledge? How can you know? So how do we gather knowledge? Okay, that is at the basis, okay, or at the basis of the scientific method. Okay. For instance, think like empirism. For instance, they say, no. The scientific method, especially now the physical, okay, now the natural science, for instance, physics, right? Or chemistry. This is the empirical method. Empirism basically means, hey, we have to observe phenomena. We have to observe them and say, this is a phenomenon. What are the variables? Okay, so how do we measure the variables or the indicators? And then what are the measures? How do you observe them? How do you make sure that? How do you record them? How do you process them? So for instance, we say, if you can't see something, you can't touch something, you can't smell something, you can't taste something, you can't measure something, then that's not reality. That is not, so anyway, I'm basically trying to say that at the very base of science is actually philosophy, and sometimes scientists ram it down our throats, behave as if science is reality. Perhaps one can argue that science is based on facts, observable facts, and out of facts you make observations and you get patterns. Then from patterns you make explanations, and basically those are theories. Okay, I'm making it very simple. But let me not go back there. So I was just talking about the Greeks. So they still rule the world. Greek way of thinking. So in 500 AD, now the Greeks used to live in city-states. They never used to live like where we live here. The Greeks used to live in city-states. You probably heard of a place like Troy. Okay, they used to live in city-states. So think about it. So more than before all the other peoples, they used to live in cities. So you live in a certain city, but it's a state. It's an autonomous city, and it has everything. So we live there, and in terms of how we have to protect ourselves from enemies. We have to take care of. We have to make sure there's water, we have to make sure there's food, we have to make sure there's a market, we have to make sure that, how things we do, we don't do. So that was our market, a city state. So they had to come up with something to help them navigate. We're talking about 500 BC. So they termed a term called polis. If you look at it nicely, you begin to see, wait. Does that sound familiar? Metropolis, cosmopolis. That's where this is coming from. The polis is a mutually coming together, right? So like I was explaining when I was growing up as a little boy in the rural areas, the things you don't go and do in a river, because if you do it, you're going to mess everybody up downstream, right? So how do we utilize water resources? How do we, for instance, perhaps supposing you have community grazing fields, how do we make sure we utilize it so that everybody is going to benefit? How do we, for instance, what do we establish so that if I have farmed sweet potatoes and yams, I can be given a space where I can go take them, and from there I can probably be able to buy, I don't know, we can do butter tree. So there are so those kind of, today we talk about markets, but they were basically there, but in a more informal but well accepted way. So that's policy. For instance, how do we make sure that we organize ourselves so that there are people who are armed and they're trained so that when you're attacked by our enemies, we can deal with them? How do we make sure that we do certain things so that we don't endanger the health of others? So that's the policy. How do we make sure that we all benefit? So that's a city state. So how things are organized as communities. So in that city state, so think about things economic, okay? Things, people working together. How do we, cultural things, what are the norms? How do we do things? How don't we do certain things? Is there a leader in that city state? How do they become leaders and how do they govern? Things like those. Issues like religious activities, all those kind of things, so that the relationship that existed and how they work together to support community, so we can be able to live together as community. That was a polis. Okay, that's a concept of the polis, the Greeks. So for these Greeks in these city states to be able to live together, and remember, this was not like the constitution. They didn't have formal things like those, but there are ways in which they agreed to live by. Okay, we didn't have, for instance, formal laws and formal constitution, no, but they established this. So think about it. There will be policies, guidelines on how we do certain things, how we establish markets, guidelines on how we, train people for war. When we are attacked by an enemy, what we do, practices on, say, how we do agriculture, how we, for instance, hey, I want to do irrigation. You can't just go up and dam a stream, and then everybody else downstream don't have water. Things like those. So the policies. Then, of course, there are things we've all agreed should be done in a certain. Those are norms. Okay, then of course maybe certain standards. If for instance I bring to the market, say, I don't know, potatoes, they have to be of a certain acceptable standard. I can't bring, for instance, that in a certain way. Today we talk about, standards and whatever stuff, KBS, Kenya Bureau of Standards. And if you want to export stuff to Europe, you must keep us. But even then, you don't take a goat or a cattle that is sick. Those standards. Then, of course, cultural guidelines on how they actually decide things. So it becomes what we call the social contract. So this policy has a social contract. It's like a contract that governs the behavior of everybody in there. But of course, for the policy, it's not written. It was not formal, but it was like a social contract. We agree this is how we're going to live. So that is the concept of the polis. Okay. So of course, there's certain things we have to think about. What is a good joining together of diverse people? What are our obligations? What are our responsibilities? What are the things we are allowed to do? What benefit we get out of our coming together? For instance, they live together in a certain way and say, hey, we've got to make sure we have a fighter class and people who we arm them. You have to support them when there's war, So obligations to its members. So if you're a member, what are the things you expect, but what do we expect from you? So things like those. So of course the question is, what is a good policy? What is the best coming together and working together? so that their benefits, their responsibilities, their systems, their structures. We're talking about sanctions, we're talking about rewards, we're talking about a bit of punishment, we're talking about authority and power, talking about how people learn, we're talking about norms. So how does that look like for us, for a policy run well? And so basically those kind of things. So I think sometimes when you're thinking society, we live in the modern society. Of course, things are pretty formal. There's a constitution, for instance, and to support that, to enforce that constitution, or to make sure that constitution, there are laws, acts of parliament, legislations. So things are pretty formal, but you don't teach children, are not taught the laws of the land, right? And even for you, how many laws do you know? There are ways in which you learn to live, and so long you live like this, you don't get in trouble. I mean, that's the norm. Most people live in those norms, that kind of thing. So I think it's good to have that in the back of our minds as you're beginning to think about society. And so we got a little formal, and I thought of just looking at like two or three. There are very many theories, sociological theories. But sociologists have tried to explain this mutually coming together, this living together. And so from a lot of learning and doing things and observation, they've come up with certain theories. So I won't go to all of them. When I share these slides, you can actually go to this link, this URL. They are there with explanations and examples. And to be interesting to just go, maybe pick one, just look at it. So may not go into much detail, but there's one called symbolic interaction theory or symbolic interactionism. And basically the thinking behind this is that, there are certain symbols in society that we have that help us to make sense of society or help us to navigate society, so that we see certain things and then we get to know what it is. It's almost like metaphors, but not. Okay, I'm using that word very loosely. And when you look at certain things, then you decide this is how people look like. And based on that, then based on certain symbols, then you get to deconstruct that. So you see certain things, then you get to deconstruct that and say, this is how these people are, this is how this person is. But that begins to inform how we interact and how we relate to each other. So symbolic meanings that people over time have developed and they rely to be able to interact. Okay. So there are subjective meanings, for instance, and you look at those meanings, you look at those symbols and then interpret them in a certain way. Okay. I'll just give an example without going into detail. So now, the last, say, 30 years or so, most countries around the world have had to make very stringent laws to control the consumption of tobacco because, for the longest while, there was medical evidence that tobacco made you more susceptible to sicknesses and diseases, very many of them, and certain cancers, throat cancer, lung cancer, for instance. And empirical evidence shows that. But people still smoked cigarettes, right? And the tobacco industry would pour billions of dollars into marketing and sharing these trends, right? Increasingly, there's been such a fight back. You hardly see that anymore. It's just that lately I began to learn, human beings are very wise, And people are in business because they want to provide services. Others are in business to make money. So like in the West, what these tobacco companies did, they put all their resources, they had enough, and they bought food companies. So now that's another story, but I won't go into it. I don't want to get political. Okay. A lot of foods, a lot of foods that we love to eat, they don't have any value. Processed foods, they actually are part of the problem that are causing a lot of diseases and ailments, stuff like that. But let me not go there. But for instance, for the longest while, for instance, there'll be advertising. So you find young people looking at models in society, people they look up to. Okay, and maybe this is not just tobacco, but certain behavior, for instance, in the film industry, in the TV industry. So there's certain people that we look up to, and they're our mentors. It's even worse now. We have social media, right? So this influencer or this celebrity has 5 million followers, and they're held out like almost deity kind of respect and honor. They're followed, so they do certain things, and the followers, they. But the main thing here is, for instance, it's clear that, for instance, tobacco smoking kills. It causes terrible diseases, but people still do it. Perhaps because they think it's cool to do that, and that was the image, of course, all these companies used to do. Think about things like race, okay, and gender, for instance. So there's a way in which traditionally the way we looked at race is in a certain way. I grew up in a certain part of the country where we looked at certain different communities in a totally different way. And I had descriptions and just ways of thinking about different communities that were just bizarre, almost dehumanizing. Well, and you remember we talk about education and learning. You're not told, but you hear people referring to other people like in a certain way, and you grow up knowing that. And sometimes we talk about tribalism today. We're fighting that scourge. Thank God your generation is beginning to fight back and say, come on, get on my, back off. But back off, but in social media in the cities, and perhaps even if we look at what some of the protests we are experiencing early on this year, if you go to the rural areas, you probably didn't see much of that. Okay. So, but you grew up to see people through a certain lens. So I see someone from a certain community, I associate them with this. And stereotypes, huh? So why I grew up and came from, there's a joke told in this country, if you want to know somebody from Central Province is really dead, they're dead. You just come and throw some money and it falls on the floor. And this guy doesn't wake up, then he's dead. So where do these stereotypes come from? Where? So there's a way in which you look at this community and these guys are like this. That's what we basically talk about. So for instance, you decide, like now in the West, if you're a person of color, people begin to look at you like this. That's basically what he's saying. But come on, we're human beings. We all have 46 chromosomes. When you go to the hospital, you don't say, is this white blood or Indian blood? You want blood. You know what I mean? If you want, for instance, someone needs to, what is it called? A transplant, you don't say this transplant came from an Asia. This transplant came from, this. No. So we're the same. It's just that our melanin, our skin, whatever, and that's basically in terms of physiology and physiology and biochemistry, we are all the same. But how is it that you look at those people and say, those ones, That is basically, so you use certain symbols to interpret certain people, to project certain people. So when you see that community, you interpret them in a certain way. That's basically this interactionism, whatever, okay? And there are also all kinds of things, racial, skin color, it's kind of, and it's so serious sometimes that, for instance, research is done where, you look at certain people and you think because of a certain gender, certain color, they are more intelligent, stuff like that. That's basically that theory. So, because of time, I may not go much into this, but there's a conflict theory that the thinker behind this is Karl Marx, way back in the 18 something, 17, 18 something. You have to understand the society. You have to understand these are the days of the Industrial Revolution, and industries has just taken place, and people have gotten into the cities and living in hovels, in horrible, terrible conditions, and all the land was owned by the nobles, by the kings and the nobles. And so people would actually go to eat. You have to go to this land owned by the nobles. You're farming for them, but to pay you they give you food because you don't have land. Then when the industries began, people went to the cities, and then they lived in horrible conditions to be able to get this. Okay, so that's the world in which, think about places like Russia those days. That's where somebody owned maybe 50,000 hectares of land, and people living in there were basically they are serfs. They're basically like slaves, and you just farm for them, and you just farm there for food. Someone could actually go on there gambling, then he runs out of the money, and then he decides to gamble with his serfs, his slaves. So you just come, he loses the gambling, and then you all come, the whole family is just taken away. That's the kind of environment these guys lived in. So they came up with this theory. Again, observations, and then, tensions and conflicts arise when resources, statuses, or powers are unevenly distributed between groups. Okay? So you're basically saying, for instance, in that society, all the land belongs to a certain class. And if you're not born in that class, like kings and nobles, then you don't have land. And if you don't have land that you have to live, then the conditions are created such that you have to go to some of these places to get food. So, that kind of thing. Or you go to industries and you're paid peanuts, just enough to live by. And then you don't have land. So those kind of things. So resources were within a certain few people. And then perhaps to be able to get that wealth, you need to be born in the certain, or certain opportunities. Then, of course, power. So because of that, of course, as more and more people are disfranchised, marginalized, of course, tensions begin. And of course, it begins conflicts. And basically, conflicts then, of course, will happen until there is change. Okay. And so different ways. Okay. So, of course, because of that, it brings inequality. I mean, think about certain countries, for instance, I was talking about the West, like some of the many countries in Europe, they had kings and nobles, and everybody else. Okay. Places like India, for instance, there will be caste or case, whatever you call them. So if you're born in a certain case those years, then you're there. You're a warrior class, or you're the non-touchables, or you are the priests. So that kind of thing. So you don't have access to that. So it brings inequality, and because of that, then of course it brings conflict, and then of course there's conflict. Then it increases until there is resolution. Okay, that was Karl Marx. I'm basically just stating a theory. Um, so inequality of conditions or opportunities, um, you know, I mean, you think of countries like Congo, for instance. Um, Congo, they say that Liver Congo is able to provide hydroelectric power to probably half or more of the continent. They say they have all the minerals that are needed. All the minerals exist there. If for instance they would begin to do timber farming and export, they'll be able to pay their debt within a few years. Food is not an issue because they have equatorial rainforests, and so they would feed Africa. So they would be able to give power to Africa, feed Africa, and all that. But those people are the poorest of the poor. They're always fighting and terrible, horrible atrocities. So you think, of course, they're the Congo people. No, they can't be the Congo people. So where do those guys get all those weapons? This conflict and displacement. People are displaced because other people want to come and mine, get minerals and stuff like that. So probably that inequality of you know maybe of conditions. Then of course inequality of so that brings about conflict. Okay, so that was basically conflict theory from Karl Marx. So this is a totally different way of thinking about society, functionary society. This word function. So it's like it looks at a macro level, so that this guy, the guy behind this is called Dahem. Society is like an organism, okay? So it has components, and those components have a function to fulfill. And so, so you're there because you're fulfilling a function. So if you don't fulfill it, then you can cease to exist. Okay, so it's a function. So there are different functions in society, and everybody plays a function, and you have to fulfill it. And if you fail to do it, then of course something can actually happen to come in to fulfill the void. So they are those functions are social institutions and that are designed to fill certain different needs. For instance, a social institution that is important is family. For instance, it's government. For instance, it's economy, media, education, religion. So education plays a certain role, for instance, to be able to educate people, train people, because people are needed to fill the labor market, okay, and to be able to have livelihoods and to be able to be productive. So it's playing that role. So it's hard to play that role. So if it fails to do that, then there's a way in which it can disappear or it can be replaced by something else, okay? Or maybe things like government. I don't want to get into this space, but the other day people on the streets and saying so and so must go. So and so must go, and government is not doing this, government is not doing that. We demand this. This is our right. Doing this. So that was an institution. That was actually a function of society, because we have agreed as a country there's going to be something called the executive, right? And the executive is actually given certain obligations or certain things they must do by the constitution, which the Kenyans have agreed. This is our formal social contract. So, and there are laws to actually govern that. But then people say no, we don't want to know, So it means that function is not functioning the way that people think about it. Then until people are saying we don't want, get rid of it. It has to go. Then you realize, wait. So that's basically, but that's a gist of what we're talking about. Think about the economy. Think about the markets, for instance. So an institution only exists because it serves a vital role in society. If it doesn't serve that role, it will die away. Maybe a new one will emerge. So that is basically functionalism. So for instance, if something is deviant, like I was explaining, if the education system is failing to where it's supposed to, then people will rise up and demand it has to go and has to be replaced by something else. Okay, then of course, when one function is dysfunctional, for instance, say the economy is dysfunctional, it affects all the other parts and creates problems. Then of course, people rise up, try and fix it and maybe do away with it. So it basically changes. So that's functionalism. So I look at the last one, then we'll be done. So this is just listen, these are very different lenses through which we look at phenomenon. So I made things very, very simple in the beginning. I was saying science is, you look at phenomenon and then you think these phenomenons, their laws or their patterns. Okay, then using those patterns, you make explanations. Those explanations of established patterns of how it behaves becomes basically laws. Those laws become theory, right? For instance, we think about the classical theory of gravity. So these scientists looked at the way that bodies operate and exist and how they affect each other, and they made some certain observations and certain measurements, and they established that these measurements in these conditions are always the same. So they actually came and talked about the law of gravity, or maybe the law of motion. The second law of motion, for instance. Force, can be equated to mass times acceleration, right? So they observed it. Looks like force and acceleration, mass has to do something. So there's acceleration, then you stop it, that kind of thing. So then they come up with some handshakes on how this works. Then you set up experimentation and control experiments, and you observe and then you say, yeah, there's a pattern emerging. So this pattern becomes a law, and use that pattern makes explanation. That is actually theory. Okay, I'm making it very simple. So there's a way in which these are lenses through which we try to explain phenomenon or explain society or explain life, right? So you have to think of them like that. And if you don't think of theories like that, then you get mesmerized by the scientists and the people who claim to be very learned and very, 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 very educated and wise. But these are just lenses through which they're just explanations of patterns, and sometimes you look at them as experts, but that's basically what it is. So think about them as different explanations on how society operates, again, from very different ways of thinking about it. So this functionalism views society or the mind as a complex system of interconnected parts working together to fulfill specific functions. It emphasizes the interdependence and harmony between different elements within a system. Functionalism suggests that social structures and mental processes exist to serve specific purposes and contribute to the overall stability and equilibrium. And of course, like we said, if one part doesn't play its part, then it ceases to exist because people rise up and demand it has to go. So that's one lens of thinking about society at a macro level, So this other one is the same society but very different. The assumptions are different. The givens are different. The way you think about it. So it's again explaining a certain different phenomenon in this society. That's conflict theory, power struggles, and inequality. So society is carried by inherent conflicts arising from competing interests and limited resources. It emphasizes the role of social, economic, and political inequalities in shaping social relations and institutions, highlighting how dominant groups maintain their power at the expense of subordinate groups by, for instance, controlling the means of production. For instance, think about it. Think about apartheid South Africa. In apartheid South Africa, if you grew up, you're born black, you, for instance, were told you couldn't do medicine. There was a small quota people going to medicine, like maybe only 5% would be black. Maybe engineering, maybe 5% will be black. Because you're born black, then you can't get access to the education. So you can't get access to, to opportunity. Okay. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about. So people rise up and say, wait, they are not, if you born black, then only maybe 5% of people going for law can come from the black community. So before long, then you grew up and because, so that begins to cause conflict. Then of course conflict. That's so it's a different thing, but it's called conflict theory. The last one, which you probably heard about, against the theory of society, is rational choice theory. And again, if you think about it and the other ones you looked at, this is a totally different lens through which you're looking at society, trying to make explanations that seem to make sense. Individuals use rational calculations to make rational choices and observe to achieve outcomes that are aligned with their own personal objectives. So I have objectives. So given opportunities, I'll make a rational choice of what serves my objectives, okay? So the assumption is that we are rational creatures and we rely on reason and logic to make decisions, period. Okay, so reason, logic. So I have objectives, I want to meet them, okay? When faced with several courses of action, people usually do what they believe is likely to have the best overall outcome. So that's a basic premise behind rational choice theory. Whether it's true or not, we can debate. But again, perhaps they will do experimentation to more or less say, yeah, this thing seems to, the patterns imagined seem to suggest it's true. So this is true knowledge. So now we tell everybody and we accept it. The assumptions is that decisions are a simple matter of cost versus reward. You remember cost versus reward. So how much, what is the cost and what is the reward? So based on how much shall I expend in terms of time, in terms of effort, in terms of maybe resources, and what is my reward? Then I look at an alternative scenario and I say, I think that one that has less cost or more reward, that's what I want. That basically is it for thinking. People take actions when benefits outweigh costs. Benefits outweigh costs. People will take no action, stop taking action, or take opposite action when costs outweigh benefits. They find it's more painful, or it's more costly, or it's taking forever, or the reward is very little. Then think about the way, for instance, how at certain points in our lives, certain professions, people never used to go. When I came to university, for instance, people would, like where I went to school, if you felt you may get certain grades, you went to medicine, you went to engineering, right? You went to pharmacy, you went to dentistry. And probably some of us found ourselves in programs because that was it, And so courses, for instance, program like economics began to suffer because there are not as many people going there. Today, programs like you'd hear our politicians talking about it. This program is useless. I've heard very, very senior members, for instance, talking about anthropology, just dismissing it, wasting resources and okay. Then of course, turns out, for instance, I think you've heard me say this, a lot of people working in design, in industry, designing systems, designing human systems, designing systems that affect human beings. They're actually going back to anthropologists because they understand human action, they understand empathy, they understand how to engage with community, to understand how they think, to understand their pain, to understand they're actually going back there. But we rubbish them. And the top design companies actually having anthropologists working in the design teams to help them. But I was just talking about programs and career. So you found people saying, I can't go to this, I can't go to this, because at that point the thinking was, if I do engineering, I'm just saying then, if I do engineering, by the time I'm done, I'm going to get a job, right? If I do, for instance, law, by the time I'm done, I'm going to get a job. So I don't want to go to do sociology, economics because of this. And that basically, there's a way in which sometimes it plays out. Or for instance, you're in high school and you're thinking, what do you want to come and do? So, all right, people utilize resources, they have a time to maximize opportunity. So that I want to make sure that the least resources or the least effort to maximize. Okay, that's the assumptions behind the rational choice theory. Okay, so the rational choice theory. So our behavior is going to be based on our preferences. Okay. Sometimes when you want to explain theory, you use structures. You use what you call models or frameworks. So the behavior of people is basically based on people's preferences. That's what we're talking about, objectives. So when I want to make this decision, then I want to look at all possible options, including trade-offs, and then I weigh the costs and the benefits, right? And then I make behavior to maximize my benefits and to minimize my costs. That's basically the whole thing, right? Then, of course, sorry. So of course, because to be able to weigh the length or the balance or the barometer through which I judge these options is based on preferences. So those preferences are going to be based on my 5 norms, personal value, competence, resource allocation, resources that you have, okay? Right? So I look at all that, and then I decide this one I'm going to do, right? Okay, so then of course you're saying, at some point, you get a certain place of equilibrium. For instance, I want to be able to purchase this. So I have this amount of money, and these are the options. I need to live under a roof. I need to put some clothes on my back. I need to eat some food. So, but on the other hand, maybe I want to buy a car. So I look at that and then I said, okay, fine. So that's basically the rational choice theory. But you see, it makes some assumptions. So the way we behave. So this is actually, if you think about it, some of them like the functionalist theory or the conflict theory, they operate at the macro level, societal level. So theorizes, like strength makes explanation how we operate at that level. This one clearly is at top personal level. Of course, it could be at an organizational level, but increasingly, of course, it's based on personal level. Okay. So of course, if you look at it very well, it's actually based on the personal basis. But some people argue that it can actually be used to look at interactions. Okay. Where, for instance, time, information, approval, and prestige are the resources being exchanged as opposed to perhaps things like money and things like, things that you can acquire with money and stuff like that. So, of course, individuals are motivated by your wants or objectives or desires. Wants and goals are driven by personal desires. And of course, you've already seen where that you come from. There will be different norms, personal, whatever, and stuff like that. So, of course, because you can't get what all you want, then you have to make choices based on your goals and the means you have. Okay. So that basically means if it's rational, then you have to be able to look at this. What I have, these are my options. So you have to know all your options. Never mind, we never have perfect information. For instance, in markets, it's very difficult to have perfect information, but we should. Then you look at, if I make this decision, this is alternative. Then you look at the alternatives. Then of course you make the decision which best serves them. So that's the assumption. Okay. That which is likely to give them the greatest satisfaction. Okay, so of course, an assumption is that, all action is rational. For instance, there are people who will not go to a hospital and then they say you can't give them blood, donated blood. So you have to ask yourself whether that's rational. So are there times when we act irrationally? So does that assumption hold every point? So, but then the thing is that this theory basically, it's a theory. It basically assumes that everything is rational and calculated, and it kind of like silences or ignores or downplays the other forces that drive decisions. Okay. Then, of course, the more problematic one is that you're saying that complex social phenomena, societal level, can be explained in terms of individual choices that lead to that phenomena, which perhaps may be problematic. Okay, which of course elementary use, individual human action actually affects everything else. So if you're basically saying that you look at people as individuals, then you can actually extrapolate it to the society, which is a bit problematic because perhaps it's not as easy to be able to do that. So the problems as you finish, when it comes to collective action at societal level, it's a bit tougher because, we have other scenarios where, for instance, people choose actions which benefit others more than themselves. For instance, parents do that all the time. So what happens to a parent? They're not really doing it, you can't argue that it's actually rational, because it's not that it gives them the best satisfaction and best based on desire. Okay. So for that reason, okay, sorry. This thing is rational choice theory does not address behaviors that are selfless. Okay, it's not that. Sorry, there's a not. It's not there. So selfless philanthropic behavior, you can't explain to me that Bill Gates keep giving billions of his resources to social causes. You can't tell me that that can be explained by rational choice theory. So of course, norms. Some people tend to follow social norms, and people, that lead people to operate in selfless ways that override their self-interest. So then the theory is in trouble. We can't be able to explain that because it assumes everything is rational and it's based on your goals and then your options and your desire. Okay, so that's a problem. It's too individualistic. So there are clearly larger social structures that cannot be reduced to things at the individual level. So that becomes then problematic. Okay. So I'm not asking us to to be able to know these theories, but the reason I raised them is so that we can see there are very many. I've just picked like 4 here. There are very many. The different social scientists, however, the years try to explain society, because society is very, very complex, because it's the people in there are human beings, and human beings are very, very complex. and our relationship and our structural systems are not easy. So to try and make sense out of it, so of course we propose some hunches of how things work, then we set up some seeming experimentation, and then we observe in gamma patterns, and of course we try to make explanations, okay? But we began, if you remember, from the very beginning, we were saying, the society is made up of individuals, there's collective action, community living together, and we said that there's social, they're social systems, okay? The social organization systems, okay? Then of course we then are coming down to the theories, okay? So maybe it's a way of recognizing that the society then is not as straightforward as you want to think about. It's not so that when you're thinking about perhaps ICT society, would you then just limit yourself to a certain theory because a lens of looking at society? So for instance, when it's coming up with certain policies, say for instance, ICT policies in our country, what is our lens to look at society? Or does that matter? Okay, but when it comes to impact or outcomes, how does that relate to? And maybe perhaps it does in a certain way, which sometimes you need to think about. For instance, if because of a stratified society, certain groups, maybe community groups, don't get access, say, to education and to learning, and so they are not educated, they are not learned, then perhaps if you rolled out certain programs that people require to be learned, to be literate, to be able to access them and use them, what does that leave them? Okay, for instance, say you have communities that have no exposure at all to digital skills at all. So when you roll out certain services, for instance, government services. So I like to make this case. So we have the e-citizen, and the executive branch has said, we know most of our services, government services, you get access to them through e-citizen. And increasing more and more are getting in there, even to pay for them and everything. What if I don't have any digital skills? What if I don't speak English? Because they're all in English, right? What if I don't have a smartphone? What if I can't connect to the internet? So you say, oh, you got to a Huduma center, right? What if the Huduma center is 300 kilometers? I'm talking about some of these counties are huge, like Turkana County, for instance, or Mandera. The Huduma center could well be 250 kilometers away. You know what I mean? And there may be no vehicles or roads. So it raises interesting things to think about when you're coming up with policies that seemingly are supposed to. So for instance, we are busy trying to come up with an AI policy for our country. So do we, what is our thinking? What is our unit of thinking? What is our view of society? You know? So you talk about benefits of AI. Cool. So who would be able to utilize this technology and the innovations to be able to benefit? Is it the 90% of the Kenyans? So that's the reason why we are raising some of these issues and some of these theories, so we can begin to think about. So it's not just some, I don't want to use that word. It's not it's not learning for the sake of learning. That's what I'm trying to say. That's why we looked at different lenses and perspectives of looking at technology and then ICTs. And we're looking at different ways of looking at certain ICTs. I don't want you to freak out and say, oh, this thing is looking very esoteric, looking very abstract. No. We're coming down to us shortly. But a lot of time at stake is we got technocentric and begin having technology forecasts and some of the things that we think are likely to happen. And we forget that society is complex and the outcomes, the impacts will be affected by some of these social structures and systems and organizations. And if you're not alive to them, then you roll out policies, and when they fail to have impacts, then you wonder what happened after spending a few $billions. Okay, so I'm setting the stage. Like I said, hopefully on Wednesday, God willing, we shall look at something that is foundational to helping us be able to unpack this in very practical way that is very hands-on and things you have to learn and be able to do and to apply. But I thought this is important for us to have that background. And perhaps after Wednesday, I will stop being the talking head and you will start doing the learning, because you'll be given things you need to do to be able to work together. So I think let me stop there. I couldn't even see you. I hope you're still there, but in case you have questions or reactions, we can talk about it before I let you go.